As Bloom is abused and pimped out by Bello, there's one point where he says, "Moll, I forgot. Forgive. Moll, we still..." I love these flickers of hope within him, the sense of conflict, and it reminds us that there's no easy answers for Bloom. At one point, he thinks he's reliving the memory of meeting Molly at Matt Dillon's that night, long in the past. He thinks he sees Molly, but it turns out it's not Molly, it's Millie, his daughter. And he's kind of Rip Van Winkled himself into the future, and she's like, "Oh, you're an old man now. My, it's Papley. But, oh Papley, how old you've grown." This recursive process through history of forms happening again and again. There's a feeling that he's like stepping out of his life, looking back on it as a whole, and just seeing it as something that he's becoming less and less capable of affecting, but he still has this desire to kind of reach out and act, to do something, to live, to love. But he must witness his own passing. It really does have a Christmas Carol of, Scrooge seeing the ghost of Christmas past and seeing his life pass before him and just being kind of locked outside of time into the grooves of his life. Then there's this part where this nymph starts talking with Bloom, a young woman, and this nymph is from a picture that they have framed at their house, at the Bloom house at Eccles Street. And we get more context about Bloom's youth from this nymph. Apparently when Bloom was a young man, he, I think in high school, went on a field trip, like a camping trip, to Pulafuka, this waterfall further south from Dublin. And when he was there, I guess he had some opera glasses. He was kind of spying on one of his female classmates, and it's kind of unclear what happened, but it seems like he masturbated to her. So the incident with Gertie McDowell was apparently not the first such incident of love at a distance for Bloom. And all these things, all these women are encountered at once. Like he's seeing the girl when he was a young man, he's talking with this fantasy nymph, he's interacting with the prostitutes in Bella Cohen. All this is happening at the same instant. But then there's a shift. Bloom gets his lucky potato back from Zoe. He asks for it. He says, "It is nothing, but still a relic of poor mama." Perhaps the magic of the potato is not the potato itself, but the memory that it evokes of Bloom's mother. Coincidentally, Zoe, her last name is the maiden name of Bloom's mother, Higgins. Perhaps the memory of his mother, the woman that in his memory could give him some kind of unconditional love, allows him to dispel all these other women fantasies and any women who are trying to tear him apart in the present. None of that seems to matter as he has this memory. And soon we're going to see something similar with Stephen. He's going to have that memory of his mother, and he's going to recall that he's going to say to her, "Teach me that word known to all men." Again, love. Bella is no longer in her fantasy form of Bello, but she's still, trying to run a business. So she tries to get down to business and says, like, okay, which girls are you going to pay for, and so on, trying to get money from Stephen. It's interesting that this is the point that Bloom really stands up to her. I mean, Bloom is always pretty fastidious about money, but I think when he can endure all manner of abuse on himself. I think that's a very key idea for Bloom. He can endure abuse, but when you start attacking other people, when he started attacking Stephen, who he's kind of sees as his son, then that's when he steps in and he says, okay, I'm not going to let you take advantage of him. And even if he's drunk, he's going to protect his money. So he gets Stephen's money and he says, I'll hold on to it for a while until you're not drunk. Stephen, by the way, at this point is so drunk that he cannot light his cigarette. Stephen's starting to have his own fantasies. He's having, remember in A Portrait of the Artist, when he broke his glasses and Father Dolan smacked his hand and said, "You're a idle little schemer," and John Comey's there too. He's reliving all that experience. So we're starting to move the focus from Bloom to Stephen. Zoe seems to be a fortune teller. She says, "I'm going to read your hand." So she takes Stephen's hand and starts looking at his fortune. But then Bloom, because he something ominous in his fortune is coming up, he says, no, don't read Stephen's hand, read my hand instead. And initially, Zoe's fortune for Bloom is totally wrong. She said he's going to marry money or something. It's wrong. And Bloom's like, nope, wrong. But then she goes, henpecked husband. And that really kind of touches a nerve with Bloom. And this launches a fantasy with Lenehan and Boylan. And Boylan is going to be arriving at Bloom's house and saying like, I'm here to do some business with your wife. As a courtesy, Boylan says to Bloom, you can apply your eye to the keyhole and play with yourself while I go through her a few times. About this point, Stephen starts to realize that in this dreamlike atmosphere that this is actually the scene from his dream the night before, and things start to get a little musical and giddy, but then his father shows up and says, think of your mother's people, and Stephen says, dance of death. So easily does the current shift with just a few words, and Stephen has a horrific vision of his mother. Stephen's mother, emaciated, rises stark through the floor in leper gray with a wreath of faded orange blossoms and a torn bridal veil, her face worn and noseless, green with grave mold. Her hair is scant and lank. She fixes her blue-circled hollow eye sockets on Stephen and opens her toothless mouth, uttering a silent word. A choir of virgins and confessors sing voicelessly. This is no longer silly, mocking horror. This is truly haunting, and Stephen it really affects him. As fate and horror and time start to overwhelm him, and his mother begs him to repent, to pray, and he repeats that non serviam from A Portrait of the Artist, I will not serve, and in his torture, he takes his ash plant, his cane, and he hits the chandelier and breaks the light of the brothel. He lifts his ash plant high with both hands and smashes the chandelier. Time's livid final flame leaps, and in the following darkness, ruin of all space, shattered glass, and toppling masonry. It ends Stephen's horrific vision, but Bella Cohen, she's not happy. She wants to call the police for the damage of this drunken young man. But Bloom, he intercedes. He's got an ace up his sleeve. Remember that knowledge, that clue I mentioned a while ago. He knows that Bella Cohen, her son, is at Oxford. So he kind of subtly brings that up and kind of uses that as like a knowledge point that, Stephen's a young man too, kind of preys on her sympathies. And he gets her to relent and not call the police. She lets them go with, paying the damage for the chandelier, but then they get out of there, which is a relief. And then Stephen is a little ahead of Bloom, so Bloom pursues him. And as he's leaving the brothel, a few people, Corny Kelleher is there, and there's a few men with him, and Bloom doesn't quite look at him. He kind of turns away, but there's an indication that this may be Blazes Boylan and Lenehan. Not the fantasy that we saw earlier, but really them there. As Bloom catches up with Stephen on the street, he's in the midst of an argument, and it seems that those two British soldiers that we saw long ago in the beginning of the episode, that they're a bit angry, a bit miffed at Stephen. They think they're with Sissy Caffrey, and they think that she's been insulted somehow. It seems that they left her for a few moments to take a piss in the alley or something, and Stephen spoke with a few words with her or something, and when they came back, they were like, what are you doing talking to my girl? I mean, we don't know exactly what happened, but that seems to be something like that. Keep in mind that they're all pretty drunk, so it doesn't take much to set them off. Bloom arrives on this scene. This is what he comes to. Private Carr is ready to give Stephen a knuckle supper, but Bloom is trying to dissuade him. He's saying no, he's a professor, he's a poet, you don't want to do that, he's just, he's a little drunk, he tries to get him out of there. But Stephen has to go and kind of escalate by mentioning the King of England, King Edward VII, which Private Carr does not take well to at all. And Stephen, he's just totally bored by the whole situation and wants to get away. But he says, "Will someone tell me where I am least likely to meet these necessary evils?" Bloom really tries to de-escalate the situation, but it just can't be helped. Private Carr is pissed off, and he punches Stephen in the face, knocking him to the ground. And chaos ensues, and despite Bloom's attempt in the brothel to keep the police away, the police arrive. They seem inevitable, and they show up. When the police arrive, it looks bad for Stephen, like they might be taking him away to jail that night, so maybe we'll have somewhere to stay that night. But who should show up at this point but Corny Kelleher, and he knows the police. He's a police informant, so he has some influence, and he gets Stephen off the hook. With just a light warning, Stephen is free. And when I was reading this section this time, I noticed and thought about it a little differently. There's this part where Corny says, Corny Kelleher to the watch with drawling eye, "That's all right, I know him. Won a bit on the races, gold cup. Throw away," he laughs. 20-1, do you follow me? Now there are a few ways to read this. Joyce, as I've mentioned, I think many times, loves ambiguity. But I was thinking about this a little differently from any way I'd ever done this before. When he says won a bit on the races, who is he referring to? Is he referring to Bloom? Has he heard about Bloom's, the misunderstanding that everybody has is that Bloom won a lot of money on the races? Is that what he means? Or, this is the new idea I had, is he referring to himself, that he won a bit of money on the races? And I was thinking about this. Why would he mention this at this point in time? What does it have to do with anything? And then it occurred to me, is he, when he says, know what I mean, is he like insinuating a bribe to the policeman? He's saying like, I've won a bunch of money, and I think, we can overlook this. That's my idea that I had this time. Why else would he bring up money all of a sudden? Seems kind of strange, right? I'm going to bring up money to get this young man off the hook. A few lines down more, we have this part. Corny Kelleher nudges the second watch. "Come and wipe your name off the slate," he lilts, wagging his head. "With my tooraloom, 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 tooraloom. What, do you follow me?" Second watch genially. "Ah, sure we were too." Corny Kelleher winking. "Boys will be boys. I have a car around there." Second watch. "All right, Mr. Kelleher. Good night." Corny Kelleher. "I'll see to that." See to that? See to what? See to Stephen? See to paying them off later? What is that? And is this Touraloom, is this some kind of, this magic spell? Is this some kind of Jedi mind trick? What is going on here? Or like Charon, the guy that gets the people across the river Styx, they have to be paid their coinage. Perhaps inadvertently, maybe Kelleher is the only one who actually, heard from maybe Bantam Lions in the morning about Bloom's tip. Maybe he took the tip. Maybe he won a bunch of money, and that was, in a sense, the coinage being paid to Charon to allow them safe passage. Safe passage through this dark underworld. And I love how this wild tangent, and I acknowledge that it is speculation, so that's what I do with Ulysses. But I love that it all comes from the fact that Kelleher does not use a pronoun when he says won a bit on the races. So we don't know who he's indicating actually won on the races. Whatever the case, Kelleher has gotten Stephen off the hook, and he says that he's in Nighttown because he just dropped off a few commercials, and one of them lost some money on the races, which is what leads to the suggestion that this is Boylan, because Boylan lost some money on the races. Kelleher is a very ironic presence here in Nighttown. I think maybe I mentioned this before, but I want to mention it again, that we may have thought because he's an informant that he's maybe a bad guy or that he's going to inform on somebody, but it turns out a reversal. Joyce has turned that around. His position as an informant is what allows him to act and intercede for characters that he knows, like Stephen and Bloom. Kelleher offers to give Stephen a ride home, but then Bloom says he thinks he's down in Sandy Cove, and Kelleher's like, whoa, that's a long way. And he's like, well, see you later, dudes. And he lets Bloom take care of Stephen. Stephen, he's having trouble reviving because I guess he got smacked and plus he's drunk. So when Stephen finally does come around, the first thing he says when he sees Bloom are, "Who? Black Panther vampire." And then he babbles out that "Who Goes with Fergus" poem. With Stephen literally in Bloom's hands, his responsibility, the chapter ends with Bloom having this vision of his son Rudy as a fairy boy of 11. Against the dark wall a figure appears slowly. A fairy boy of 11. A changeling, kidnapped, dressed in an Eton suit with glass shoes and a little bronze helmet, holding a book in his hand. He reads from right to left inaudibly, smiling, kissing the page. Bloom, wonderstruck, calls inaudibly, "Rudy!" Rudy gazes, unseeing, into Bloom's eyes and goes on reading, kissing, smiling. He has a delicate mauve face. On his suit he has a diamond and ruby buttons. In his free left hand he holds a slim ivory cane with a violet bowknot. A white lambkin peeps out of his waistcoat pocket. This is such a weird image and a weird way to end the chapter, but I love it. And of course, remember, Rudy died not at 11 years, but 11 days. Shakespeare's son Hamlet died at 11 years. Maybe this is conflating forms like I talked about before. We actually saw Shakespeare referring to him as antlered, comparing him to Bloom as also being cuckolded. So maybe Bloom and Shakespeare are merging, maybe Rudy and Stephen are merging, all these forms are merging. I also like how this vision of Rudy, he's gazing unseeing into Bloom's eyes. How do you gaze unseeing? I guess Rudy is going to be forever mute to Bloom, but he will have a chance to communicate with somebody, an erstwhile son in the form of Stephen in the next few chapters. A few other notes I want to add before we wrap up this episode. There's been talk throughout the book of Bloom being a Freemason, hints of it, and we see a lot of it as symbolism and his hand gestures in this episode. This is very tangential. I came across this book and I read this part and I want to share it with you because it made me think a bit about Ulysses as a whole. The book is called The Symbolism of Freemasonry. I have not read the entire book, I just read the opening. It's by Albert G. Mackey. I'll link to it below in the information. But in the very beginning, there's this paragraph I want to share, and it goes, "Of the various modes of communicating instruction to the uninformed, the Masonic student is particularly interested in two, namely, the instruction by legends and that by symbols. It is to these two, almost exclusively, that he is indebted for all that he knows, and for all that he can know, of the philosophic system which is taught in the institution. All its mysteries and its dogmas, which constitute its philosophy, are entrusted for communication to the neophyte, sometimes to one, sometimes to the other of these two methods of instruction, and sometimes to both of them combined. The Freemason has no way of reaching any of the esoteric teachings of the order except through the medium of a legend or a symbol." Think about what Joyce is trying to communicate through his legend in this book and the many symbols that fill this episode and the entire book as a whole. So we've learned quite a bit about Bloom in this episode, a lot more about his personality. Before now we'd seen kind of him talking to himself in his interior monologue, and we've seen him referred to by other characters. But now we've seen the darkest visions and the darkest possibilities for what he is capable of and what he might have done. So we still have to take him as a whole. Joyce said he wasn't creating a hero, he was creating a person, a personality, a real being. So we have to take him as a whole, and I think we have learned so much. I don't know, I still like Bloom, no matter what he might have done in the past. I think he's still capable of redemption, and I think he's still a pretty incredible character. And I hope this episode hasn't put you off of him, and that you are able to continue. The rest of the book, the last 3 episodes, this is considered the last part of the kind of the adventures of Ulysses traveling around. The final 3 episodes are the homecoming episodes. I think the big obstacles of the book are behind us. The remaining 3 episodes are pretty easy to handle, and they're going to give us even more insight into Bloom and the other characters.